Recall petition for MP Rob Roberts would be won, says Watchdog. It would be won to change rules so a disgraced Wales MP is subject to a recall petition, a parliamentary watchdog has said.
Delin.
The Lynn MP Rob Roberts was suspended for 6 weeks after he was found to have sexually harassed an employee. But he will not face a petition that could trigger a by-election. The chairman of the panel that investigated the complaints that the rule change, proposed by Labour, would threaten the group's independence.
Irwin.
Stephen Irwin, chairman of the independent expert panel, said he was seriously concerned by the plan. Labour said its bid was completely workable. MPs can be subject to a recall petition if they are suspended for 10 days after a report by the Standards Committee, but a petition was not triggered in Mr. Roberts' case because the section was recommended by the IEP, which examines bullying and harassment complaints against MPs. Parties on both sides of the House want to close the loophole, and House Leader Jacob Rees-Mogg tabled a motion to that effect to the Commons on Tuesday. But the bill failed after Labour tabled a rival amendment attempting to make its retrospective, meaning it would apply to Mr. Roberts. Parliamentary procedure means that the Labour amendment was considered to be in itself an objection to Mr. Rees-Mogg's change, stopping them from being agreed. Mr. Roberts sits as an independent after the whip was removed from him by the Conservatives, although he remains a member of the party. Criticizing the Labour amendments, Mr. Arendt said he would be glad to see the abnormally abolished for the future, provided his panel's independence was maintained. But that is a very different matter from giving any such abolition restorative effect so that the outcome in the case of an individual MP is altered, he wrote. He said the Labour proposal went against the principles that sanctions determined by the IEP should be final and no retrospective sanctions could be imposed that were not available at the time. I also consider that this paragraph infringes on the independence of the IEP, since if implemented, it would amount to a political decision affecting the sanction in an individual case. He wrote it would be wrong for a session to be altered by another route than a proper appeal, as it would set a very undesirable precedent. Labour argued that the government has been able to make retrospective laws elsewhere, and it was not wise that an MP could sexually harass staff and return to Parliament. It was the UK government to make time for a vote on whether Mr. Roberts would be subject to a recall. Shadow Leader of the House
Thangam Debonair.
Tangam Debonair, shadow leader of the House, Tangam Debonair, said there is no excuse for the government's law to act on this before summer recess to close the loophole, ensuring that the system has failed as its heart and will allow his constituents to decide if he is the right person to represent them. A neighbor source later added it was not unreasonable or without precedents that the recall loophole here would apply retrospectively, given changes that had been made to the recall law in the past to allow for retrospective punishment where an MP of convicted of a crime that occurred before the law came into force was subject to its provisions. Mr. Roberts, former employee, said the MP repeatedly propositioned him and asked him to be less alluring. After his suspension ended, Mr. Roberts has since appeared during Commons debates in person, including Tuesday afternoon. Watchdog to prompt Grange police officers' use of force in video. An investigation into Grange police use of force has begun after video emerged of an officer using a number of baton strikes on a man. Footage was shared last week by which Black Lives Matter groups after the incident was filmed on the 9th of July. Events unfolded after a 41-year-old man was approached in connection with alleged driving offense. An altercation began, and the officer apparently used incapacitating spare and his baton. The Independent Office for Police Conduct is investigating after a referral from Grant Police. Operations Manager
Melanie Palmer.
Marion Palmer said video footage of part of the incident has been released widely through social media. We will ensure we look at the full circumstance of the overall interaction. Grant police officers had with the man in the lead up to the during the arrest. We are investigating whether the officer's use of force was reasonable, proportionate, and necessary in the situation that unfolded. We have contacted the man to explain our rule and how the investigation will progress. The incident occurred after two officers approached the man. It is alleged that he initially made off before the encounter being investigated, said to have happened in a garden at Newfree Court in Batters, Newport. Grant Police previously said it was aware of a video and the officer was not currently working in an operational role as inquiries were ongoing. The force has also said a 41-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of driving while disqualified and driving without insurance before being charged later.
CH subbed Tom Harding.
CH sub Tom Harding said the man was also arrested on suspicion of assaulting an emergency worker and obstructing an officer in execution of their duty. He was later released under investigation on those charges. Backlash as paying the staff rules called unworkable. Industry bodies have reacted with dismay as the government's plan for firms to apply for staff to be exempt from coronavirus self-isolation rules. The government has said there will be no list of critical workers exempt from isolating rules, and exemptions will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Karen Dee, chief executive of the Airport Operators Association, said the scheme was simply unworkable. The food supply industry called for clarity on how the scheme would work. The new policy comes after Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced on Monday that fully vaccinated people in critical roles in England would be able to continue working even if told to self-isolate after being in close contact with someone who has COVID. The new rule is limited to those with those COVID symptoms. Individual businesses will have to contact their relevant government departments to apply for any exemption. Those deemed eligible, which includes NHS and care staff, will be able to take daily tests instead. Downing Street said that the first exemptions around self-isolation have been given in some critical sectors. The number of exceptions outside of the NHS is expected to be relatively small and not reach the high tens of thousands. There are ongoing discussions with companies in critical industries. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said a number of those exemptions are in process of being granted or have been granted. Pandemic. Firms have warned of increasing staff shortages caused by people being forced to self-isolate by the NHS COVID app. Iron and Granny King said on Monday they had had to shut shops and pubs as a result. Business Lobby Group, the CBI, has warned that the problem could hamper the economic recovery. World Migrancy of the World Haulage Association said the plan felt like it had been thought up on the whole without proper organization or fraud. Truckers were classed as essential workers at the start of the pandemic. Now they may be or may not be, he said. It's too confusing. The criteria isn't clear and it's risks being both unfair and devastating to an already cracking supply chain. Ms. Dee of the Airport Operators Association said the government must We consider and exempt categories of workers, such as airport security staff and air traffic controllers, from the requirements to self-isolate. As 24-hour operations, we lay clear rules that are workable and easy to implement, or there is a risk of unnecessary temporary closures, she said. Applying for each individual for an exemption from self-quarantine if they are painted is simply unworkable. Sean Bentland, chief executive of the Cold Chain Federation, said, "What is the application process for business to use this? Who will clarify? Do you have to prove you are severely affected? How long will it take? If it's not simple and quick, it will not help, and most businesses will have to ignore it." He said the number of people absent in the food sector due to isolation requests was growing exponentially across the food supply chain. Andrew Saley is the chief executive of food wholesaler Bradford, which has about 500 employees across the UK and 24 depots. He said the number of staff who were self-isolating changed on a day-to-day basis, but added the company had well over 100 people off at the moment. The firm, which has large contracts with schools, hospitals, and prisons, recently had half a shift off at one depot due to staff being told to isolate. Mr. Surrey said it was a little ridiculous to expect individual companies to seek exemptions for staff who had been told to self-isolate. He added entire sectors, such as food supply, should be exempted, and the government scheme should work in the same way it did for key workers at the beginning of the pandemic. The government has said it is crucial for people to quarantine after being pinged by the NHS COVID-19 app. Its message from comes after Business Minister Paul Scully said it was a decision for individuals and employers whether they should isolate after a ping from the app. The Times reported that another minister in the business department, Noel Grimston of Baskerville, stressed in the letter to one large employer that the app was only an advisory tool and that people were not under any legal duty, not a blanket exemption. The Prime Minister's office spokesman said business critical areas would be able to apply to be exempt from isolating. It's not a blanket exemption, and my understanding is we are not going to be producing a list covering individual sectors, he said. It's important that anyone who feels they are in a critical industry or wants to raise potential issues because of isolation are able to contact departments and get advice and where necessary get exemptions. Asked specifically about supermarket workers, the spokesman said, "We are not seeking to draw lines specifically around who is not exempt. What's important is to make sure critical services are able to function and get that balance right between requiring people to isolate, but also making sure critical service can function."